One of the best examples for ancient machining is sitting out in the sun at this site. I think we've got some new observations to offer on what this actually means, and quite frankly, the implications are pretty wild. We'll get to that.
Here we can see part of a knob and the scoop marks. This is very similar to the face of the blocks
Mankara,
of Mankauri.
That's the depth of it's insane.
Dude, that's really cool. But this is a super interesting piece of machining that's left on this. I'm actually kind of always amazed to still find it here. So this isn't a straight cut. You can see there's actually a circular cut. So you've got a massive either swing saw or circular saw that's run through this. The other feature about this block is even weirder, is that it's concave. It's like it's been machined in like two directions.
There's nothing on the high points that indicate a back and forth scratching. It's something came across here and left these lines, but this is definitely the witness of a spinning cutter. Yeah, it's just, I mean, this is the smoke of the gun, absolutely.
It does really bend the brain a little bit to consider this is actually what happened to it. However, this is following the evidence in the stone to where it leads. Welcome back to Uncharted X. This is Ben, and I hope that you're all doing well. Today, we're getting back into the evidence for ancient machining, with an examination of one of the more mysterious artifacts that comes to us from the amazing remnants of ancient Egyptian stonework. This video is a further chapter in making the case for some seriously advanced technological capabilities that must have existed long ago. Capabilities well beyond anything that the dynastic Egyptians, at least as we know them, with their toolboxes of rough stone and copper tools, could have ever managed to produce. This argument for an older and more ancient form of high technology has a lot of evidence behind it, and correspondingly a lot of context surrounding it. It's a complex topic, it's nuanced, and details matter, but from a technical, engineering-oriented perspective, the evidence for it is frankly undeniable. I've gotten into these topics before on this channel, and I generally break down the direct evidence for ancient technology into three categories: machining, precision, and logistics. Machining, which is what we're talking about today, is the direct evidence for sophisticated, powerful tools being used to shape certain artifacts and architecture. The witness marks still wrought into the stone, the overcuts, striations, curves, and even the signatures of mistakes that were made by these tools, as well as the complex, difficult geometries they produced in very hard igneous rock. Precision, the observable, measurable existence of remarkable levels of consistency, accuracy, symmetry, complexity, and tolerances on the surfaces of said machined stone artifacts. They range from the large, be they things like statues or single-piece boxes, to the very small, as evidenced by the amazing discoveries made surrounding the ancient Egyptian and pre-dynastic hard stone vases. Precision as a capability is only ever developed in the pursuit of function, and levels of precision exist in examples of ancient Egyptian stonework that are far beyond anything remotely capable of being delivered with primitive hand tools. Rather, these levels of precision rival those delivered by our own civilization today with our advanced machines. And then there's logistics, the in-your-face evidence for incredible feats being completed far back in ancient times. Things like the quarrying of single stones weighing in excess of 1,000 tons that were then transported over 1,000 kilometers, of which we have several examples, including some that went upriver on the Nile against the current. Also, some of the most illogical, contradictory impossibilities that are pushed onto the public as facts exist in this category. Things like the cumulative efforts of quarrying, shipping, shaping, and placing literally millions of tons of stone with precision in very short periods of time, with nothing more than pounding stones, barges, ropes, sleds, and human effort, not even with the use of the wheel or with force multipliers like pulleys. Today's installment, however, is focused on machining, and to do that we're going to investigate Abu Rawash, a rarely seen, unique ancient Egyptian Old Kingdom pyramid site that has some of the very best evidence for ancient machining. along with some remarkable architectural features that gives us insights into pyramid building techniques and that have strong connections to other sites and monuments. This is a video that I've been wanting to make for quite some time. I wanted to get back to some of the more detailed, focused, engineering-oriented videos looking into evidence of things like machining, and one of the best examples for ancient machining is sitting out in the sun at this site. I've been visiting Abu Rawash pretty regularly since around 2020, probably been there 5 or 6 times now, so I've had the chance to repeatedly inspect this artifact. And with the help and insight of some engineers and manufacturing experts who have both visited the site with me, as well as people that I know personally, I think we've got some new observations to offer on what this actually means and what this site is telling us, and quite frankly, the implications are pretty wild. We'll get to that. I'm going to do something a little bit out of character here and try to control the scope and the length for this video. I had an outline as well as quite a bit of written script done for a full deep dive into Abu Rawash, getting into its attribution to Pharaoh Djedefre, all of the aspects of pyramid building that are revealed to us by the essentially deconstructed state of the structure and Great Pit here, as well as its connections to Zaywat el-Ayran, which is Egypt's Area 51, if you want to call it that. But rather than try to cram all of those topics into one long video, I want to focus specifically on the evidence for machining at this site and how it relates to the other examples of it that we can see in other parts of Egypt. As I said before, I have discussed this topic before. You can think of this as another chapter in that investigation, but the last time I really talked about ancient machining was a few years ago at this point. Since then, I have spent a whole bunch more time on the ground in Egypt, being able to investigate these things firsthand, as well as spend a lot more time on dedicated research. So it's definitely time to revisit some of these topics. I'm totally going to still cover those other aspects of Abu Rawash. They're very interesting, as is Zaywat el-Ayran. I actually spent a whole bunch of time translating Barsanti's original French reports of his excavations there, and there's a whole bunch more to that story than I think is out there in the public domain at this point. So there is a lot more to cover at Abu Rawash. I'll get to that in a part 2 of this video, because, as I said, there's a lot more on this site than just this one, albeit one remarkable granite slab. A bit of background, if you've not heard of Abu Rawash before. It's an Old Kingdom pyramid site, the most northern of all of the pyramid sites that exist on the west bank of the Nile in what's called Lower Egypt. It's a little over 8 kilometers, about 5 miles to the north of the Giza Plateau. It's built up on top of a hill, and from the top of that hill you can get quite a view out over Cairo, if the weather is nice, that is, which might explain just why the site has been so thoroughly pillaged of all of its stone. It's far easier to take loads of heavy stone downhill to your building site than try to go up a hill. And from that perspective, Abu Rawash proved to be very convenient indeed. The destruction of the ancient monuments here has been proceeding at a right old clip for literally thousands of years. We have historical accounts that it was used extensively as a source of stone during Roman times, and even right up to the end of the 19th century, it was still being reported that roughly 300 camel loads of stone were being taken from Abu Rawash daily. The great Flinders Petrie, in his 1883 volume, The Pyramids and Temples of Giza, described Abu Rawash well, and he also made some quite prescient remarks, frankly, about the tooling used on these sites, as well as the true scope of the destructive quarrying that has occurred here. Quoting Flinders Petrie, quote, "Beginning at the north, the first pyramid is at Abu Rawash, 5 miles north of Giza. It is situated on the top of a striking hill of white limestone, a culminating point of the Libyan desert, which is seen from far in the Nile Valley. This hill is deeply scored by watercourses which wind through it, and its Nile face rises at a steep slope of 35 degrees. On this hill there are apparently the remains of 2 pyramids, but of one of them nothing much can be stated without excavations. Of the other, the general appearance is a large pit cut into the rock, with a passage leading down to it, about 10 courses of limestone around it, and a great quantity of broken stones heaped about it, making a mass some 300 feet square and 40 feet high. Beyond this are heaps of granite chips lying in a line all round the pyramid, and most abundant just in front of the entrance. Leading away northward from the pyramid is a causeway nearly a mile long, and in some parts 40 feet high, running down to the plain. The rock-cut pit and passage were originally lined with fine Mokattam limestone, which, it is said, was stripped out in the time of Muhammad Ali by a mudir. Since Weiss's time, some more masonry is gone, and this pyramid, perhaps the most ancient in existence, is being quarried during High Nile at the rate of 300 camel loads a day, I was told. An important question about this pyramid is whether it was ever finished. It has been often written of by Weiss and others as being unfinished, and the rude stone hammers met with here have been classed as implements left by the workmen. We now know, however, that jewelled saws and drills were the tools used by the pyramid builders, and the rough stone hammers are of exactly the types belonging to the rude remains of Ptolemaic times. These, therefore, more probably tell of destruction rather than of construction. The great heaps of granite all round the pyramid show that it has been cased with granite. And as it is always believed that no casing was put on a pyramid until the core was entirely finished, this is evidence of the completion of the pyramid. The far larger heaps of granite in front of the entrance show that it had been lined in part with granite. Now, all these heaps, like the hammers, tell of destruction, for throughout them broken pieces of worked surfaces of granite may be seen, some with two planes meeting, and also many blocks which have cleavage holes in them, are too large to be mason's waste, and too small for casing blocks, but exactly such as would result from cutting up the casing. The large amount of masonry carried away is shown by the depth of 6 or 8 feet of chips lying on the top of the remaining courses, so that the objection that there is not sufficient bulk here for the pyramid to have been complete is put to rest at all respects by the remains of what has been destroyed." End quote. This is often a point I hear people talk about when it comes to Abu Rawash, that the pyramid here may well have been an unfinished pyramid. I do disagree with this. I agree with Petrie in this case, because if you go to the site, as I have many times, you can actually see just massive, huge berms of essentially quarry rubble, fragments, chips, all of the little pieces of discarded waste material that come off from what could only have been very extensive quarrying operations happening over a long time here. Also, I love the fact that Petrie references that this may be one of the oldest in existence pyramids, and of course it's also cased in granite, and he's attributing it to the, the typical precise machined work of the pyramid builders, talking about fragments of granite that were finished, with two planes meeting. He's talking about two faceted faces meeting. He also makes reference to the jeweled saws and drills, which is his way of trying to explain the striations and the machining marks that we see on so much of this material, as opposed to the rude stone hammers, as he calls them, the types of technology that were in use by the actual dynastic Egyptians right down to the Ptolemaic times. It's always one of those big contradictions that the older stuff is always far more sophisticated than the newer stuff, particularly as it relates to Egypt. It just doesn't make any sense, and Petrie knew that. Abu Rawash in the standard model is attributed to King Jedefera, who was the son of Khufu of the 4th dynasty. Khufu, of course, building the Great Pyramid. And the pyramid here at Abu Rawash, which was once cased in megalithic granite blocks, as mentioned by Petrie, is thought to have been around the size of the 3rd pyramid, that one which is attributed to Menkaure at Giza. There are still some truly huge granite blocks still on site and in evidence here, although the vast majority of them, as mentioned by Petrie, have been quarried, recycled, and removed.
Yeah, and this is the angle, eh?
This is potentially a facing block.
Yeah, this is like reflecting the wedging technique, so it was under the process of quarrying. Here we can see part of a knob and the scoop marks. This is very similar to the face of the blocks
Menkaure,
of Menkaure, which means
that's the depth of it's insane.
That's the depth of it. Quite deep for a casing stone,
isn't it?
Yeah. Like half this size was going to be fine.
That's a good point. I'm gonna have to show the boys that one. Interesting.
Dude. Yeah. That's really cool.
Yeah, Yusuf pointed it out to me. I was like, damn it, he's right.
Yep.
This might also be finished.
Yeah.
It's big, dude. Yeah, it's huge. It's a big piece.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So this
and
would
it's
actually have been the front. If this is a Minkara like
You
style.
just like this could be another casing stone. Yeah.
So this is the front of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be another casing stone potentially.
Yeah.
Hit him again. You go back and hit him.
Reckon that's the front?
Yeah, this is the front.
Front pillowy face.
Yeah.
So that means it wasn't finished yet.
Yeah, very much like Mankara is what it looks like. Yeah, it could be.
I mean, it could be actually that they were built at the same time and they both stopped work.
Yeah,
Right? I mean, that's very speculative, but
it is.
it's the same style. It's obviously the same style.
This could be another casing stone.
Yeah.
Look at the front here, the front side. This is like a worked surface, but the front side here has the slope and the pillowy.
Yeah, this one. You got a big groove on the corner. Maybe this part here.
Yeah, that's what we were saying. Yeah.
Exactly. This is, yeah, right here.
Yeah, and they got to yeet all this off. That's a lot of
This
stone to
was going
remove.
to be exactly like the kiss in the third pyramid. So
Yep.
It's actually got like
Oh,
corner cut.
it does. Yeah,
he
look at
pointed
that.
it out.
That is a cut corner. Like it's this way, right?
You got two different angles here too. One's going in.
Yeah, so it's fitting in.
That's a flat face, and then it came in and fit.
It's notching into another
Yeah.
block,
Yep.
or notching into the limestone behind it. Yeah.
which shows that it was already
Set in place.
set in place. Exactly. Not that it was just here in order to put it.
Yeah.
It's been yanked out and quarried. Yeah. Very cool.
And this
All they did was that tiny little dash. And they gave up.
This is the beer for the beer for the pyramid builders.
They drug all the stones.
Abu Rawash is often overlooked in efforts made to tally up the logistical marvels represented by the structures attributed to the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. But just here alone, we're talking about many hundreds of thousands of tons of stone, much of it granite, and certainly I would say some of these blocks would have originally been in the 30 to 50 ton range, if not more. All of the granite here was likely quarried from Aswan, which is over 500 miles to the south. After quarrying, all of that stone was transported all of those 500 miles north, presumably on the river, but once they were actually away from the river, it had to be brought up to the top of a hill with a 35-degree slope, which is the slope of the Nile-facing side of the Abu Rawash Hill. If you ever hear people get into the nuances of trying to discuss the ramps that they built to try and bring the big granite blocks up for like the King's Chamber on the Great Pyramid, they always talk about, well, the slope angle could only be a few degrees just so you can actually get big blocks in the 50-plus ton range up this hill. How were they managing to bring up blocks of 30 to 50, if not more, ton range up a 35-degree hill to get to Abu Rawash? Although we humans have been using the site as a convenient source of building material and been pillaging it thoroughly for the last several thousand years, we've still not managed to cart away all of the ancient stone. Despite this, you're expected to believe that all of the original stone here was quarried, shipped to the site, brought up the steep hill, shaped and placed with precision, and the entire pyramid complex, the mile-long causeway, were all built, completed, only using extremely primitive methods in only somewhere between 8 to maybe 20 years, which is the archaeologist's best guess for the length of Djedefre's reign. Every time I discuss the logistics of building these massive stone pyramids, it's really hard not to go into a lengthy diatribe of just how ridiculous the assertions are in the standard model. Those assertions being that the pyramids, along with the many other megalithic structures that are all part of the pyramid complex, were entirely conceived, designed, planned, and constructed within the reign of a single monarch. Egyptologists have to tie the construction of the pyramid and the pyramid complex and all of the elements, the foundation work, the bedrock, everything around it, to the amount of years that a king sat on the throne, because it has to have been his tomb. There's just no other explanation offered for these in the standard model. I've gone over this logistical impossibility in some length in this video, linked below. But the timeline and the assumption that they're tombs just doesn't wash when you consider the details behind these authoritative declarations made by academics and their apologists on YouTube. Let's consider some examples. I know I'm already getting off topic and going on that lengthy diatribe, but I just can't help myself, so let's talk about it. All the precision, the alignment to true north, the sacred geometry and accurate scale modeling to the earth that is all part of the Great Pyramid, along with its 6 million tons of stone, roughly 2.5 million blocks of masonry, done, dusted and completed within around 25 years by King Khufu, which, if you do the math, works out to around 1 stone block being quarried, shipped, dressed and placed perfectly every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, non-stop. That is just the raw math of completing that many stones, only those stones of the pyramid itself, over a 25-year period. That figure doesn't include the foundation work that had to happen first.
And they are also probably, some of them is locked into the bedrock, so they make these indentations to lock these. But then in the end, like some parts of the bedrock will be lower and higher, but in the end, all this will be
Flat.
zero. Flat. Like this bedrock, this part is in a better condition because it was underneath the casing stone. So these little details of the entrance, okay, was never made to be seen. Right. Your credit card is not going to fit. Yeah. A razor blade is not going to fit. Even water is not going to seep through. Yeah.
It doesn't include the time for the subterranean work below the pyramid, nor does it include the thousands and thousands of tons of stone required for the more than half a mile long causeway, the satellite pyramids, the Western Cemetery, or any of the other extensive and hugely megalithic structures attached to the pyramid complex, like the so-called valley and pyramid temples. Nor does this figure account for the mind-bending sophistication and difficulty of building a 2,500-ton freestanding granite structure, which we call the King's Chamber today, which sits 150 feet above the ground and in the center of the pyramid, and is made up almost entirely of 50 to 80-ton megalithic granite ashlars. No, you see, Khufu just kept changing his mind on where his room should be, so they just made all this up as they went along. It's all easy peasy when it's a national project.
This is the most important thing. This is a national project.
Jokes aside, neither does this timeline or the figure of 1 block every 5 minutes account for any time to survey, to plan, and to design a complex of surpassing sophistication, requiring many millions of tons of stone. As crazy as 6 million tons across 2.5 million blocks of stone is, this is just the pyramid alone. Maybe half of the total effort required for the entire complex from concept to finished product. Getting all of that done in 25 years would be a credit to any civilization, let alone an early Bronze Age primitive culture with no use of the wheel. You want some perspective on how amazing this timeline is? It's taken the modern civilization of Egypt more time to build the Grand Egyptian Museum than it supposedly took to build the Great Pyramid and its pyramid complex. In our time, we have the advantage of modern technology, diesel power, cranes, hydraulics, trucks, modern transport, materials, and processes. Despite that, the Grand Egyptian Museum was announced in the early 1990s, and it was opened in November of 2025. That's between 35 to, say, 40 odd years to build the Grand Egyptian Museum, from concept to execution. Some 10 or 15 years longer than the estimates it took to build the Great Pyramid and its complex. Also, the Grand Egyptian Museum, it only contains, well, a piddling 1.5 million tons of building material, and much of that was concrete, which is far easier to produce than quarried blocks of stone. As batty as the claim is that the Great Pyramid and its complex was completed in 25 years or so, it's actually something that's eclipsed by the claims laid at the feet of Khufu's predecessor, Sneferu, the first king of the 4th dynasty. He's said to have built not 1 but 3 pyramid and pyramid complexes on roughly the same scale as the Great Pyramid. He's said to have built the Meidum Pyramid as well as the Bent and the Red Pyramid during his time on the throne, which spanned some 25 to maybe 30 years. As I said in this earlier video looking at the accomplishments of Sneferu, despite there being very little evidence to actually tie him to these monuments, exactly how many giant triangles in the desert does one guy need? Just the pyramids alone works out to something like 150 plus tons of masonry quarried, shipped, dressed and finished per day in order to hit that timeline. Once again, this figure does not include planning, foundation work, or any of the many other structures and their tens of thousands of tons of stone associated with the entire pyramid complex, or complexes in Sneferu's case. The whole standard model timeline for the building of the Old Kingdom megastone pyramids puts pretty much any other period of monumental building efforts by any civilization, including our own, to complete shame. Our efforts to build things, nothing on the scale of the Great Pyramid, mind you, generally take decades, if not more than 100 years if we're talking about some of the cathedrals. And that's generally with the aid of concrete, diesel power, modern transportation, and hydraulics. If you look at the details of the standard model explanation for all this, they will tell you that the entire mega pyramid project in the Old Kingdom ran from the time of Sneferu, starting around the year 2613 BC, all the way to his supposed descendant Menkaura, whose reign ended around 2500 BC, a total of roughly some 113 years, give or take a decade or two. Included in that century of time is, deep breath, the Mondoon Pyramid, Bent Pyramid, Red Pyramid, Great Pyramid, Abu Rawash Pyramid or pyramids, which were or was about the size of the Third Pyramid, the Zaywat El Aran Pyramid, which was likely about the size of the Middle Pyramid, so 5-ish million tons, the actual Middle Pyramid attributed to Khafre, and then the Third Pyramid attributed to Menkaura, known for its granite casing. This in total equates tens and tens of millions of tons of insanely difficult and precise stonework, much of it in the form of megalithic granite shipped from over 500 miles away, and that's just the pyramids. Add another very conservative, I'd say, at least 10 million tons for all of the other monuments and structures in all of these pyramid complexes, the temples and causeways, which were also made up of massive megalithic masonry. Consider the huge scale of the famous valley and pyramid temples at Giza, the Sphinx as well as its temple, all of these associated with the Middle Pyramid complex. Across them they have some granite blocks that are well over 100 tons, and some of the limestone blocks here go up to a remarkable 450 tons. We still haven't considered the time it would take to survey, design, and do the foundation work, which in some cases, particularly like the Middle Pyramid, was built into a slope, included leveling out tens of acres of bedrock, cutting an enclosure that's 30 feet deep on the western side and raising it up on the eastern side to an equivalent height with dozens of precisely fit, interlocking 150 plus ton limestone tiles in multiple layers.
These are same interlocking pieces like the tiles we just saw over there. But these are like 6-7 times bigger, if not 10 times bigger than the other one. You can achieve this work on a smaller scale because usually when you're trying to lock, there are pieces that is not fitting together. Then you usually remove the piece, remove more material, and keep trying until it locks together. But here, the challenge is different because, of course, the size. Size does matter.
Oh, and all of this, from the quarrying and shipping of stone to the building of some of the most precise and massive structures the world has ever seen, was done with nothing more than ropes, sleds, and stone hammers by teams of cheerful, butt-flap-wearing primitives who wanted nothing more than a beer, some bread, and a blanket at the end of a hard day's work.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying that the 4th Dynasty Egyptians didn't do anything here. Of course they did. They undoubtedly occupied and worked on these sites. They might have been renovating, repairing, extending, modifying, or even completing parts of these pyramids and their complexes. We know they were working here. It's written in some of the tombs found on the plateau, like that of the overseer of the Pyramid City, which I documented in this video.
To give evidence that the Old Kingdom didn't build the pyramid. They built what? The Pyramid City.
The Pyramid City, which is all what surrounded that structure.
That's what they mean. So they built
Exactly.
surrounding.
Like in modern times, we have a neighborhood, we call it the gardens of the pyramid. Something similar. Okay, so in 2,000 years later, we cannot claim that who built that neighborhood is the builder of the pyramids, but they just built a town or a city as it is written there.
Note, and I make the point in that video, this tomb talks about the overseer of the pyramid city, not of the pyramids. There are a whole bunch of inns and hotels in the villages surrounding the Giza Plateau that are called the Pyramid View or the Pyramid Room or the Pyramid Aspect. It doesn't mean the people that built these hotels also built the pyramids. They're just named after them. If you built a city at the pyramids, you'd probably call it the Pyramid City. So that's really all that you can infer from the evidence that we have. Yes, the dynastic Egyptians were there. They did do work on the plateau in the Old Kingdom. I've documented in previous videos the extensive erosional and stylistic differences between the truly ancient megalithic work and the dynastic work on the plateau. It's all in this video right here, it's linked below. Some people seem to think that recent discoveries somehow prove that everything here was done by the 4th dynasty Egyptians. Things like the Diary of Mira, which everyone online seems to be banging on about recently. This archaeological fragment, the Diary of Mira, apparently documents the shipping of some limestone blocks to the Giza Plateau. To which I say, big whoop.
Big whoop. Want to fight about it?
It doesn't actually mean anything other than, yes, they shipped some stone to the plateau. Yes, they were doing work there. It doesn't mean that they built the pyramid. Zahi Hawass, while naturally taking personal credit for the discovery of what he calls the tombs of the workers, claims that this discovery also proves the 4th dynasty origin of the pyramids and of the Giza Plateau. I've visited the tombs of the workers a couple times. I've been there with the overseers as well as with the inspectors who pretty much did all the work and run that site. And unfortunately for him, what he never seems to really mention when he's talking about the tombs of the workers is that the earliest dated inscription found in that entire place is of the 5th dynasty, not of the 4th. I'd say that in terms of the Giza Plateau, there is no doubt that these sites were worked on by the 4th dynasty, and likely many subsequent dynasties of ancient Egyptians. Much of the construction that we can still see today on the Giza Plateau certainly is their work. However, I don't think you can infer from this that they did all of it. In fact, there's quite a lot of very strong evidence to the contrary. As previously mentioned, the erosional evidence alone is strongly suggestive of much older work also existing. I think we can categorically state that the timeline of construction here is far longer than just a few successive generations of one family of 4th dynasty overachievers. In my opinion, the pyramids and the pyramid complexes are, at the very least, multi-generational projects, and have likely been subject to several very different and probably very far apart phases of construction, repair, and renovation. I think this premise also explains the carbon dates that have been found in some of the mortar samples at Giza. Although these dates are very inconvenient to the specific 4th dynasty timeline, hence they don't often get mentioned along with them being Khufu's tomb, etc., it is within a few hundred years of the general 4th dynasty timeline.
I don't believe in carbon date 14 at all.
I cover my thoughts on this topic of the carbon dates in more detail in the book that I'm writing.
It's in my book.
What did you find?
Nothing. But in summary, I think that all you can conclude from the carbon dating at the pyramids is yes, people during those times evidently worked on the pyramids. What the nature of that work was, be it repair, renovation, completing the construction, is not clear. I firmly believe that the weight of evidence overwhelmingly points towards a far more sophisticated builder culture that existed a long time ago, certainly far further back in time than the dates we currently associate with dynastic Egypt. At the same time, I believe the dynastic Egyptians were well connected to their ancestors, those who lived in the times they describe as that of the Shemsu Hor or Zep Tepi, when the gods walked the earth, which in their own history stretches back to more than 40,000 years. I think they were aware of them, they had a cultural connection and memory to them, but due to cataclysm, possibly that of the younger Dryas, but I think more likely something older, they lost any real technological or functional connection with what I call the builder culture. One way to think about this is to imagine if our civilization of today went through the equivalent of a Younger Dryas event, a real civilization ender, an extinction level event that knocked our species back to square one, back to a hunter-gatherer mode of survival, with dramatic and violent climate change and huge portions of the Earth's surface being affected by cataclysmic flood, fire, or even cosmic bombardment. Assuming a portion of humanity survived, but all vestiges of modern civilization were gone, what do you think the stories around the campfires would have sounded like? People have memories, and stories would be told. How would they describe the technology and capabilities of their grandparents to the next generation? Then to the next generation, and the next after that. How would these stories, describing the everyday technology of the 21st century, that which we are so used to in our own time, what must they sound like to a 20th generation of hunter-gatherer, who's never seen a VR headset, an iPhone, a space rocket launch, a jumbo jet, or a cruise ship? How quickly do you think religions would be started around these magical stories? How soon would symbolic references be created to represent satellite data transfer, MRI machines, forklifts, and Wi-Fi enabled tablet computers? How quickly would these stories, symbols, and connections to ancestors be altered to suit the whims, the egos, and the desires of chieftains, priests, or kings? What ceremonies might be enacted to harness the power of the sky gods and to speak with the ancestors? And how might the leaders of the time choose to style themselves as being amongst these gods, perhaps as one of them? I think this premise, for the dynastic ancient Egyptians being basically an advanced cargo cult structured around the cultural and stylistic memory of their own ancestors, along with them inheriting artifacts and architecture from them, from which they then structured their own culture, religion, architecture, and symbolism, is a valid interpretation of the evidence that we have. When you consider the tale of two industries, the evidence for two vastly different sets of technological capability, the evidence for imitation across almost every category of stonework, the technological contradictions of the older stuff being generally far more sophisticated than the later work, the erosional and geological evidence, the evidence for cataclysm, the genetic evidence for the human timeline, and combine all that with how they, the dynastic Egyptians, describe their own history and their own place in it as a legacy civilization, then I think this premise moves from simply valid towards likely. There are endless examples in the symbology of dynastic Egyptian temples that can be, frankly, quite fun to consider as possibly some representation of memories of actual functional technology that's been warped by thousands of years of structured ceremonial or religious symbolism. No doubt the dynastic Egyptians used sites like the Giza Plateau or Saqqara as ceremonial sites or as necropolises, but that doesn't mean that was their original form or function. Hell, in our hypothetical situation for our own civilization being blasted back to hunter-gatherer days, in a dozen generations or so, we might start worshipping the ruins of nuclear power plants and recreating the shape of cooling towers or skyscrapers for religious and cultural propaganda, basically clout chasing in the social structures or social media of the day. Let's just hope nobody ever reinvents Twitter. I don't see much that rules this idea out as an interpretation for ancient Egypt. In fact, to the contrary, I see a lot of evidence that supports it. So I got triggered here by the whole Abu Rawash was definitely built by Djedefre statement that is so authoritatively repeated on any website or academic publication that really talks about the site. In reality, the evidence behind this claim is far more sparse. There were some fragments of a statue or statues found at Abu Rawash during the excavations made by Emile Chassinet in the early 1900s. Some of those fragments at Abu Rawash had Djedefre's name on them. That's it. That's the evidence. I don't think I need to go over, again, the problem with dating and relating not only statues but entire sites, and in this case a megalithic pyramid, by what's been scrawled on a fragment of stone, but there it is. The statue in question, made from quartzite, definitely seems to be handmade. It doesn't have any of the signatures or witness marks of advanced technology that we can find on some other statues. Those same signatures which provide us with such a vivid contrast to the primitive chiseling methods used to add cartouches and writing. I've covered that topic in many videos, including in my last video on ancient Mendes. In the case of this statue, it's my tale of two industries in action. In all likelihood, this might well have actually been a statue made for Djedefre, and it was found at Abu Rawash. So let's be agreeable and grant this as being true. It is a statue of King Djedefre, and it was installed at the place called Abu Rawash. What does this actually mean then? Only that there was at some time a statue with the cartouche of Djedefre on it, presumably housed inside a structure at the place called Abu Rawash. That's it. Even if we go as far as assuming this means Djedefre had work done on the site, it simply does not mean that he built the pyramid and everything else here. Drawing that conclusion is a huge stretch. Like a lot of the ancient timeline, it's assumptions piled on inferences, piled on guesses, and yet these sorts of things are frequently stated authoritatively as facts. Contradictions are ignored. In this case, little things like Alessandro Barsanti also finding Djedefre's name inscribed on stone fragments at another pyramid site, Zewat el Aran, which is to the south of the Giza Plateau. This is a contradiction similar to other ones, things like Sneferu needing 3 pyramids, or Khufu changing his mind about where the burial chamber in the Great Pyramid needed to be, something randomly made up as a way to explain the multiple chambers inside it, and saying that the builders just made it up as they went along. Definitively stating, ladies and gentlemen, that Djedefre built the pyramid at Abu Rawash is a good example of the house of cards upon which most of the orthodox academic dating for these structures and artifacts of ancient Egypt is built. It's one of my issues with the standard model, that there is so much of it treated as fact when in reality it's only inferences, guesses, and assumptions. I've got a bunch more to say on this because there is some extremely strong evidence for modification and renovation work being done by some of these people in the 4th and 5th dynasties to the structures and pyramids at Giza. It's something that I've been investigating on site for a few years now. It's something new that I don't think, or certainly haven't seen anybody else talk about, but I'll save that for a dedicated video. As you can tell, I'm already getting way off track when it comes to a video about machining here. Getting back to Abu Rawash, visiting it isn't as simple as just buying a ticket. It's not a site that's open to the public. It requires special permission from the Ministry of Antiquities to visit. The area around Abu Rawash has been subject to what seems to be a bunch of construction. To me, it just looks kind of like random digging in the desert. Even the buses need to do a little bit of off-roading to get up to what's left of the archaeological site. Not something you see every day. Basically driving through a giant trash heap and trash tip to try and get to the Abu Rawash site. The bus took a wrong turn. It's pretty cool. I mean, this site isn't a tourist site. It's one of those little adventures you have trying to get to some of these places. You can see Cairo off in the distance. Probably a good time to mention that I do generally include Abu Rawash as one of the many special permission private site visits that I structure my Egypt tours around. And we'll be heading back to Egypt and to Abu Rawash in December of 2026. So if you're interested in seeing Abu Rawash or any of the other sites I mention here in person, consider joining us on December's 16-day tour of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's a great itinerary. We have 7 special permissions planned, the always fun 4-night Nile cruise. We do live music on these tours, and there's lots of videos and highlights over on my second channel, Uncharted X Live. There are a few spots still available. You can find all of the details for this trip on my website at unchartedx.com via the link below in the description, or go directly to the tour page at unchartedx.com/primordial2026. Otherwise, I don't do sponsored content here, so no native ads, despite getting those sort of offers constantly. I do prefer to rely on the value for value model. It goes along the lines of, if you do get some value from my work, please consider returning some of that value back to me, be it in time, talent, or treasure. I have a good example of the talent aspect of support in this video. A good way to support the channel and to get yourself something nice in return is to take a look at my merch store on Dashery. There are tons of apparel options in lots of designs, and the tri-blend or premium t-shirts are both soft and great quality. The whole value for value model, the methods by which you can use it, as well as the supporter-only content and benefits that I try to give back through it, things like producer credits and exclusive videos, are all outlined on my website at unchartedx.com/support. Thanks for considering. Now, back to the video. Amongst the quarried remnants and fragments of limestone, granite, basalt, calcite and quartzite at Abu Rawash, there is one particular block that, honestly, every time I come here, I'm always just a little bit surprised to find that it's still on site.
I'm glad to see it's still here.
It's not very large, nor is it super obvious, but once you get up close and examine the witness marks and the details of this stone, the mystery begins to unfold.
But this is a super interesting piece of machining that's left on this. I'm actually kind of always amazed to still find it here. Every time we turn up here, I'm like, it's still here, thank God. Like, because it's just actually, Chris Dunn, if you've read his books, Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, he makes quite a study of this block. We don't know really what it is. It could have been in the inside of something. This is like almost looks like a piece here is snapped off. Obviously the edges have been snapped off. Whoa. But there's quite a lot of interesting features about this. First of all, if you get in, you can see the striations, like the saw cuts. We'll see a good example of saw cuts, and there's absolutely a circular arc to this cut here that the striations do follow. So this isn't a straight cut. You can see there's actually a circular cut. So you've got a massive either swing saw or circular saw that's run through this, and you've got these fine striations, these passes that it's made.
As you can tell, there's quite a bit going on here. This block is similar to other blocks in Egypt in one respect in particular, in that the leading edge of the witness mark of whatever cut this thing has a curve to it. Just looking at it without any other context, it seems like it was cut with something like a very large circular saw, or perhaps a swing saw, but clearly it has a visually consistent curvature to it. Now, as we get into the details of the machining and the witness marks on this stone, I have mocked up something of a little set here with some props to kind of try and demonstrate some of these principles. We've got a Japanese little block of balsa wood with some writing on it to represent a block of granite. We have, I have this thing that I've had since a kid's kind of a holographic little spinny star thing that's going to represent a circular saw or a blade. Then we've pencil in a speed square here. When you look at this block, it looks like it's been cut by a circular saw. You can see here at the top edge, right? So the radius that is formed by something like a circular blade. It's exaggerated on this block just given the size of the block and relative to the size of the saw. In reality, in the proportions as they're shown in the video, it would be something much more like this, just little piece of, well, this little USB stick here, right? It would be much more of a curvature, something like this. But it is still a curvature because it would only represent a smaller fraction or a smaller segment of the circular saw, possibly even something smaller, say even a smaller USB stick like this one. It could be something like that. And as you can see here, I do have some mock-ups that have been made by some very talented members of my Discord. Thank you, Scooby. We'll get a bit more into the geometry of this model as we uncover the witness marks and the actions that a circular saw took on this. But just as a demonstration to show how we know this leading edge, the circular cut that we see on this block and on many other blocks, was cut with something circular, like a circular saw, can be demonstrated pretty easily with just geometry. When your entry and exit points of the cut, so we're going to mark this here on the block with a pencil, right here and right here. Those entry and exit points, you can see them written here, are higher than the leading edge of the cut, which was at the top right here. There's no way with a straight edge that we can somehow cut this shape. There's no straight path that lets you go from the entry point to the peak or to the depth of the cut and then back around to the exit point. There's just no way you can cut that shape with a straight saw. It doesn't really matter how it warps or anything like that. You do need something with a curved profile in order to cut that curved shape. Hence, a lot of people look at these marks and think, well, this is done with a circular saw. Across the megalithic sites of ancient Egypt, there are plenty other examples of witness marks that appear to be made by things like large circular saws made into the basalt and granite of various artifacts and architecture. Probably the best other example is this basalt block at Abu Sir. This was one of the artifacts that originally, on my very first visit to Egypt, way back in 2015, sent me down the ancient technology rabbit hole, as it's patently obvious that this was indeed cut with a circular saw. The striations follow the curvature, and there's even a small lip that shows us just how thin the leading edge of this saw was. Another good example of this type of thing happening is the unfinished granite box that's tucked away in a corner of the Cairo Museum. The lid was in the process of being cut away from the base of the block, and the cut went somehow offline. The piece seems to have been abandoned as a result of that. A close examination of the kerf and the edge of the cut shows what appears to be the witness marks from two large saws, one working from the top and one from the bottom.
As you can see, the blade went in a wrong direction, and that probably what caused the lid to break. But when they did the experimentation of how they did this with a copper saw under the silica sand, the amount of this, just this part here, that they went off the guiding line would take like 2 weeks. Yeah. So how can you not notice that you are going off the line with the slow process unless it was a fast process?
Yeah.
I will, in the future, take a closer look at this unfinished box in the Cairo Museum in a bit more of a dedicated video, probably one where I want to re-examine all of the boxes and their construction of places like the Serapeum. But there are many other examples of both straight saw and circular saw cuts all over the place in ancient Egypt. There are just, frankly, a ton of them at the Giza Plateau, particularly at the basalt pavement that exists to the east of the Great Pyramid. This basalt pavement made up the stone floor for what once was the pyramid temple of the complex associated to the Great Pyramid, and if you take a close look at the sides of several of these basalt blocks, you can find all sorts of witness marks for both straight and circular cuts. It's a very subtle yet very revealing area of the Giza Plateau. It may not stay that way forever. In the last couple of years, the authorities have been building a wooden walkway that goes around the pavement, and they've been using cement to try and put blocks back together, and have definitely covered up many of the exposed sides of some of these blocks that do show witness marks. I wouldn't be surprised to see in the near future they insist that tourists can only use the walkway and not actually get up and look at anything up close. Over the years, in comments and discussions about the witness marks on this basalt pavement, I've heard several people suggest that they could be modern in origin. I can speculate as to why some people might think this. Perhaps it's something like desperately trying to maintain a particular worldview that forces the rejection of any evidence to the contrary. Certainly something similar is going on with the ancient hardstone vases, and really has been ever since the evidence for those started coming out. But in this case, the case of the basalt pavement, as with the vases, the idea that these witness marks are modern is demonstrably false. They were initially documented, and quite extensively, by Flinders Petrie in the late 1800s, and as far as I know, there weren't a lot of very large gas-powered stone saws being used back then. Not that those sort of tools would leave these particular striations and marks anyway, but you get my point. Apart from the witness marks that were made in these large blocks, Petrie actually found narrow shards or slices of basalt that were sawn on both sides, which is very interesting, as it indicates that these blocks were being tuned up and essentially shaved down to size on site. Quoting Flinders Petrie from his 1883 book, The Pyramids and Temples of Giza, quote, "We therefore need have no hesitation in allowing that the graving out of lines in hard stone by jewel points was a well-known art. And when we find on the surface of these saw cuts in diorite grooves as deep as 1/100th of an inch, it appears far more likely that such were produced by fixed jewel points in the saw than by any fortuitous rubbing about of a loose powder. And when, further, it is seen that these deep grooves are almost always regular and uniform in depth and equidistant, their production by the successive cuts of the dual teeth of a saw appears to be beyond question. The straight saws varied from 0.03 to 0.2 inches thick, according to the work. The largest were 8 feet or more in length, as the cuts run lengthwise on the Great Pyramid coffer, which is 7 feet 6 inches long. The examples of saw cuts are as follows. Number 1, from the end of the Great Pyramid coffer made of granite, showing where the saw cut was run too deep into the stuff twice over and backed out again. Number 2, a piece of cyanide, picked up at Memphis, showing cuts on 4 faces of it, and the breadth of the saw by a cut across the top of it. This probably was a waste piece from cutting out of a statue in the rough. Number 3, a piece of basalt, showing a saw cut run askew and abandoned, with the sawing dust and sand left in it, a fragment from the sawing of the great basalt pavement on the east of the Great Pyramid. Number 4, another piece from the same pavement, showing regular and well-defined lines. Number 5, a slice of basalt from the same place, sawn on both sides, and nearly sawn in two. Number 6, a slice of diorite bearing equidistant and regular grooves of circular arcs, parallel to one another. These grooves have been nearly polished out by crossed grinding, but still are visible. The only feasible explanation of this piece is that it was produced by a circular saw. The main examples of sawing at Giza are the blocks of the great basalt pavement and the coffers of the great second and third pyramids, the latter unhappily now lost. End quote. Engineer Chris Dunn, who's been studying the evidence for ancient technology from a rational and professional machinist and engineering perspective, dived into the details of the evidence for circular saws being used on this basalt pavement in his book, Lost Technology of Ancient Egypt. He uses geometric evidence from photographs to demonstrate that indeed some of these witness marks can only have been made with the use of very large circular saws, and would be fully impossible to have been made with the use of a straight-edged drag saw. Recently, we also discovered these same witness marks for advanced stone cutting and circular saws at Tel Aruba, ancient Mendes, as mentioned in my last video. It looks like these same tools and techniques were used on the basalt blocks here as were at Giza.
Oh yeah.
This one looks circular.
It does, yes. And you can see the fine striations too.
And here.
Yet more witness marks for the use of circular saws can be found etched into the so-called calcite chapels of Karnak in Upper Egypt.
So here's a good example. So down here, this is, you can pretty clearly see like a circular, it's basically a circular saw. It could be a straight saw because this is concrete at the very bottom. We don't really know how far the tool goes, but you can see exactly the line that this made, right? It's busted out, like this is all broken out, but you can see the groove, the tool marking groove from this cut that dips down into this stone. And there's a bunch more on these little chapels that you can see.
This used to be one piece.
Down here on this corner, there's another one. So right down here, you have another saw cut, very well defined, like cut, either a circular saw cut or a straight. I suspect this is very much a circular saw cut. Yeah, and this one is also probably one of the best, and this is 100% a circular saw out here. Because you can actually see the profile of it here. Look at this. You can literally see the diameter of it. This looks to me like this is a saw that's been run straight down this calcite.
The point I was trying to make with all of these examples is that a circular sawn block of hard igneous rock isn't some sort of unique outlier or a unicorn when it comes to investigating the ruins of ancient Egypt. It's blindingly obvious, really incontrovertible when considering the evidence that large circular saws were amongst the tools used at some point in the distant ancient past. As you saw with many of the previous examples, this block at Abu Rawash has clearly been cut with a circular saw. There is another feature to this block, however, something that is somewhat unique, and it's something that has real implications for just how sophisticated the levels of ancient machining were.
But the other feature about this block is even weirder, is that it's concave. See, it's like it's been machined in like two directions. We're not really sure how you do that. To get this concave shape, you'd need, again, another like circular saw cut like this way, but it's also been cut this way. So it's like this quite confusing, probably a two-step process here. So you do see this dip and these lips where this machining that came this way stops here. So it's possible that it was cut this way and then it was ground down, and some machining process cut it down this way. But the striations in this are quite fine. If you put water on this, they kind of do disappear. And if anyone has a magnifying glass, it's quite interesting to look at these striations underneath. You can see them on the edge really well, but look at how they've cut through the feldspar and the quartz in this stone. But again, this is not anything that's you're never gonna get this result from grinding or from any primitive tool methodology. I mean, this is straight up evidence for machining, some sort of advanced process of machining. And machinists around the world look at this and go, well, this isn't something that is just like some primitive dude rubbing on it with rocks and sticks and sand. Like, there's some tool involved in this, and it was a powerful tool that left, these marks.
It's very puzzling when you first start thinking about it. How is this block concave? And how can the block have been cut with a circular saw in what seems like two completely different axes? Along with that, there are a couple of other features on the block that are worth noting. It seems to have a couple of kerfs or ridges or step downs where it seems like the machining process was stopped, backed out, and then perhaps started again. Returning to our little model here, it looks like this block has been cut not only in this direction, so leaving that circular witness mark at the top, but it's almost as if it's been cut like this direction, as if it's moving. A saw was moving across it like in this motion, giving it this concave approach. If you were doing this in woodwork, you would call this a cove cut, and I've got an example of what a cove cut actually looks like here, made into wood. Before anyone goes down the tired old route of trying to suggest that this block is somehow some sort of modern fake, which seems to be the go-to move for people who can't handle the evidence, this stone has been here for a long time. It seems to have been documented initially by Flinders Petrie, although I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but his description of what he found at Abu Rawash matches the attributes of this piece. Quoting Petrie talking about Abu Rawash, quote, "The pieces of the granite coffer, which I observed in the rubbish which had been carried out of the inside, are some of them curved, belonging, therefore, to a modified box coffin, partially suited to the figure. One curved piece of coffer is 8.1 inches thick, and a plain piece is 10.2 inches thick." End quote. To me, his description of a curved piece of carved or machined granite that is about 8.1 inches thick matches the description of the piece at Abu Rawash, which is a curved piece of granite that is about 8 inches thick. It's interesting to note that the edge of this block does appear to have been snapped off. It's definitely not cut. The leading edge of the part of the stone that broke away follows the radius of the machined portion. It seems likely that this was done with some purpose. Why cut all of the way through the stone if you can just break it off? Along the sides of this block is another clue that it was likely meant for some actual purpose, because we can find on the sides another edged and a quite well polished section of stone. You can see in this footage just how smooth and reflective the surface here is. This tells me that this piece was definitely intended for some sort of use. You just don't go to the effort of polishing up granite such that it reflects light for no reason. I think we're only looking at the surviving section of what was probably a much larger stone or an artifact that has been destroyed at some point, the other parts of it likely quarried and recycled. Maybe it was part of a structure, part of some architecture, or perhaps it was part of some standalone artifact. Multi-piece granite boxes, as well as entire granite structures with curvatures, do exist in the records of ancient Egypt. There are several very large multi-piece granite boxes found underground at Saqqara, for example. Also, the chambers inside the third pyramid, as well as the stone chamber beneath the Lahoun pyramid, are curved, and they're all made from granite. A circular granite coffer with a curved lid was documented in the Great Pit of Zawet al-Ayran. My point here is that I don't think we're looking at just a piece of waste or an offcut, but rather it's something that was intentionally shaped for a specific purpose. As you might imagine, a machined block of granite from ancient Egypt with these particular characteristics might attract the interest of engineers and machinists, and indeed that certainly has been the case. Christopher Dunn, in his pivotal work, Lost Technology of Ancient Egypt, made quite a study of this fragment, and he even went to the length of hypothesizing just how this block might have been machined, and then he tested his theory by attempting to reproduce the result. Quoting Chris Dunn from Lost Technology of Ancient Egypt, quote, "I tried to imagine the kind of tool that created this piece and how it was applied. Because of the radial features, it became clear that only a large circular saw would have been able to create the two radii on this block. The question that nagged me, though, was what was the size of the saw? Looking closer at the surface of the block, we can see striations that are spaced between approximately 0.03 inch to 0.06 inches apart. That's 0.762 millimeters to 1.52 millimeters. These are a common feature on many artifacts found in Egypt. The Giza Plateau provides further evidence for the use of circular saws. Though the marks on the basalt block at Giza indicate the use of circular saws, the striations left on them are different from those on the granite block at Abu Rawash. Though the ones at Giza appear to follow straight or curved lines, the striations on the stone at Abu Rawash drift from side to side from similar theoretical lines. As seen in figure 1025, the striations wander slightly from a true straight or curved path, but inexplicably, each of the striation wanders in the same direction as its neighbour and follows a parallel path. This does not support the view that abrasive slurry was at work to create these marks. It seems to be powerful evidence that fixed cutting points that are set into a rotating cutting tool were acting on the surface. Why then were the lines wandering from a true path? A possible explanation for these striations is that there was some wobble in the saw as it moved across the granite." End quote. So from my own observations of this piece of granite and taking a close look at the striations on it, I do echo what Chris is saying here, in that the striations themselves on the block, they're very, very fine. They do wander, they do definitely, as you said, wobble or wander around, and they seem to do so in groups. I think this is actually an important feature of the block, and I think it is explained pretty well in his hypothesis for how this might have been machined, continuing with Chris Dunn. I tried to imagine a process in which the piece would be cut in one single sawing operation, but I could not come up with a method that did not demand more out of the tool than it was possible due to an increase in surface area being cut. In other words, assuming a larger block was being cut along the striated surface with the saw on an angle, depending on the thickness of the entire block, the thin block, which is the one we are studying, would break away from the thicker one. But passing the stone across the saw on an angle would result in an increase in the surface area being cut. End quote. So I just want to return to our model here to try and describe and show you what Chris Dunn is talking about. He's suggesting that the saw was, or the block was cut at an angle. So if you can imagine, we turn the block around here, so you've got your radius at this top end, and you've got this concavity on this face here. He's suggesting that, well, if this was cut at an angle, so if you imagine turning it on the side and the blade being pushed through the stone essentially at an angle, so you would have a radius on both sides of it, but you would have to push it this way, almost this way. So the face of the saw is doing all of the work, not the edge. It has to remove all of this material. If you were trying to cut it down such that you left just a thin strip that was, your leading edge was here and you were concave down here, if you're cutting this in and then you're just pushing it along the saw, it's doing all of this work. You have to remove all of this material, and it would put a huge amount of pressure on the front face of the blade. I don't think that's how it was cut. That would be extremely inefficient for the face of a blade like that to do all of that work. You'd be cutting away an awful lot of the granite. It seems quite unlikely that this block was cut in a single pass or a single motion by pushing it into the saw at a 45-degree angle and then using the face of the blade to just remove all of that material. It must have been a more complex multi-step process, and that is indeed what Chris Dunn found. It does involve an initial cut at 45 degrees, quoting Chris Dunn. To cut the block by pushing it at an angle against the face of the saw not only would apply significant lateral forces, but it would also be inefficient because the volume of material to be removed would be increased tremendously. Without going back in time and witnessing how this block was cut, we can only speculate, but having thought long and hard about a possible method that would remove the least amount of material and provide the features evident on the block, it involves cutting the block in 3 operations, as seen in figure 1028. The operation seen in figure 1028, stage A, created the compound arc and broke off what appears to be a block with the pyramid angle, shaded area. End quote. All right, so again, we've got our block of granite here, we've got our circular saw, and again, remember, you know, this is all to like a much scaled up size, right? This is intended to show you the curvatures a little more completely than it would if it was on a block of the right dimensions. What he's saying is that the initial cut was something like, you know, a 45-degree cut into the stone at this end here, right? Until you could break away a piece. So right here. So you're cutting in with a saw, or the saw's vertical, but you know the block is put on an angle, and it follows this line down here until this block can snap off. So you're left with this snapped off section. Now you'd have a radius here. You'd have a radius in both directions on the block from this one cut, and it's removing this much material. This block gets snapped off. It's a block at 45 degrees. You could then take it and potentially machine it down and change it to 52 or 57 degrees with a slice, and you'd end up with a pyramid angle block, right? Back to Chris Dunn, quote, "In pursuing an answer to the puzzle, it was necessary to calculate the radius of the saw, and the granite block at Abu Rawash provided the attributes to calculate the radius, with perhaps a tolerance of 5% of the diameter. To achieve this, it was necessary to use both radii swung around the y and x axes. The figures given here are the result of measurements taken under specific conditions. I make no assertions that they are perfect measurements and that they are not subject to change if the stone is examined under laboratory conditions. The 2 and 3 decimal point callouts do not imply 2 and 3 decimal point precision. Yet I do assert that they both indicate, with close agreement, that the saw that cut this block had a very large diameter. Our view of the calculated arcs along their theoretical axes does not reveal the saw's true diameter. It assumes that the centers of these radii were located perpendicular to the camera's axis, whereas the cut surface being studied had a concave radius cut along its length. These conditions suggest that the saw that cut both radii must have been on an angle, or that the granite block was pushed into the saw at an angle. By knowing the dimensions of both radii, therefore, we can make a more accurate calculation of the saw diameter. When viewed at right angles, the radius cut at an angle into these stones is seen as a segment of an ellipse. A useful trick in machining is to tilt a cutter on an angle to machine a larger radius in a workpiece. The rules are that the block has to be much narrower than the cutter in order to avoid creating more of an elliptical shape. The formula that is usually found secreted in a toolmaker's toolbox under or inside a copy of Machinery's Handbook is given as the cutter diameter over the diameter of the desired radius equals the radian measure. The following table has been created by adjusting the cutter diameter until the radius from the top view and the radius from the end view produced an angle that combined added to approximately 90 degrees. A difference of 0.6 degrees is noted and expected, considering the lack of a precise laboratory inspection of the block. End quote. I think we can demonstrate what Chris is talking about here with our little model. Basically, he's saying that if you are cutting this block on an angle, right, if your saw is not flat, it's actually on an angle, it's going to cut, the radius is actually going to be a segment of an ellipse. Because this surface isn't flat, this radius that you see here, because there's a concavity to it, it's not actually the radius of the saw. And I can demonstrate this. All we have to do is make sure that the edge of this block is basically 90 degrees to the camera, so it's straight up and down from the camera here down to the block. And again, let's mark the edges of where this saw would be on this radius, right? In fact, we can probably just mark the whole radius, pretty much like that, right? So you see it's like that. If I take this and I tilt it, you notice what happens? You see the edges, where these edges are, where the edge of the blade is, you're actually going up and it's going further and further. It's covering, it's covering those marks. So you're actually cutting a wider radius by doing this. So if I was to cut this block at an angle, all you were measuring was this radius right at the end here, it's going to look in fact, if you tilt it all the way up, it's just going to be a straight line, right? But at any other angle, it's going to basically cut a wider radius than would be if the saw was just at 90 degrees. So what he did here to calculate the dimensions of the saw was to take the measured radii from the top view and the end view, and then adjust, using that formula, adjust the cutter diameter such that the radian, or the angle, essentially made 45 degrees. You put them both together, you get 90 degrees, which is a perpendicular view to the angle of the camera, right? So by doing that, Chris found that within a few percent, only like I think it's 0.6 degrees, that a saw of this particular diameter, 37.5 feet or 11.43 meters in diameter, could make both of those cuts into the stone. It would be responsible for cutting both of those angles if it was indeed used at a 45-degree angle into the stone. I know it's kind of difficult to follow here, but I think the takeaway is that that radius of those cuts, both the concavity of the block and the end curvature on the top-down view, those two radii are connected. They could have been made by a saw of the same diameter, with really only a small margin of error. And in fact, as I said before, he actually tested this in plastic. Quote, "This was tested in a milling machine on a micarta plastic at 1/61st scale model, the results of which were compared to the photograph of the granite. The process involved tilting a cutter on a 45-degree angle and cutting along the x-axis until I had reached a point where I could break off the material at the cutting edge." End quote. So by observing the characteristics of this block, looking at the striations, looking at the curvatures and the radii that were cut into it, and then testing his theory on a scale model, Chris Dunn came up with an explanation for how this block might have been machined. And of course, when we start talking about circular saws of potentially this size that we're seeing, this is actually a scale model that Scooby on my Discord made for me, showing you basically the size of that block relative to a 11 plus meter saw. This is a diagram that's actually to the measurements and the scale as suggested by Chris Dunn. It's kind of hard to imagine. It does really bend the brain a little bit to consider this is actually what happened to it. However, this is following the evidence in the stone to where it leads. Now, of course, one other observation that Chris made and that I tried to have reflected in these images is that for a saw of this size to be operating at a place like Abu Rawash, it's very unlikely that you are going to tilt the saw itself to cut into the block. It's much more likely that the granite block would be tilted and then pushed into the saw. Let's return to Chris Dunn's proposed 3-step machining process and follow through with the remaining operations. Quote, "The operation seen in figure 1028, stage A, created the compound arc and broke off what appears to be a block with the pyramid angle, shaded area. Stage B cut parallel to the bottom of the block and produced another triangular block, which may have also been used as a pyramid block. These blocks are nowhere in the vicinity at the site and must have been carried off with many other blocks. These cuts left a thinner block, which is the focus of our study. At this point, the block would have had a flat face with a step down to the radial break. Then again, for unknown reasons, it appears that the builders decided to make the surface even across the length and pass the piece along the saw, where at 2 points there was movement in the block and steps in the surface were left." End quote. Okay, it's a 3-step machining process that explains this block. Now let's go back to this model and check out and see if we can replicate what Chris is talking about. The initial cut, a 45-degree cut right here. So you're cutting in with a saw, follows this line down here until this block can snap off. So you're left with this snapped off section. Now you'd have a radius here. You'd have a radius in both directions on the block from this one cut, and it's removing this much material. This block gets snapped off. So then beyond that, he said the next phase was to actually cut it at a parallel to the bottom. So now we're taking the saw and we're cutting like this along the inside, along the block from here, right? Well, from here, right? So it's cutting down here. And then this is the block that gets snapped off. And in fact, the funny thing is, if you looked at the footage earlier, you can see blocks almost exactly of this shape, where they're very long in this direction, and they have that pyramid angle on the front. And again, this could have been sharpened up to a steeper angle, to a sharper degree than, say, 45 degrees. And as Chris said from his image, and I'll put it up here again, when you're finished with this stage, This section of the bottom block, this bottom piece, is all that's left. This is flat, and then you have a step down to a concave, essentially a concave section here that is also curved at the end from that original, well, from here, from that original 45-degree angle cut. And then the third process is, if you imagine all this block is removed, the third process is really to then take the saw and either do repeated little drop cuts depending on how wide this blade is, or you're just moving it back and forth against this blade to not a great depth. It's only a little tiny depth because you've only got like about an inch and a bit of concavity to that block as per Chris Dunn's measurements, and then that actually explains all of the marks and the machining process that might have been used to create this. You would have straight striations going this way because the last process was this motion coming down on the block. It's not curved. You will get some curved striations. You'd have your concavity at the end because of that initial 45-degree cut. So there is another feature on this block that is kind of explained by that angle change, that difference between a 45-degree angle on that initial cut and then the 90-degree cuts, or the 90-degree machining that was made into that surface of the block. And that is the small step down, or the little kerf that is here about 4 inches from the top of the block. You can see it in this footage right here. Chris Dunn tested his theory as to why that particular step down might have existed. Quote, "This theory was tested on a piece of plastic, and a predictable step was created where the cutter was used perpendicular to the surface rather than at an angle, and therefore cut a smaller radius." End quote. We did that demonstration before of showing you that when it's at an angle, we're cutting a wider radius, right? So it's actually a shallower radius. If you can imagine it going this way, it's actually going to be a shallower radius for where it hits the edge of the block. However, if you go all the way up to here, or rather all the way down here, it's going to be ever so slightly deeper cut because it's a smaller radius. So you're going to have more of a difference between the edges of where the blade is touching the block and the depth, the deepest point of the cut. So you can imagine as you're coming down, you're hitting the edge, this way is going to cut ever so slightly deeper than if it cuts at an angle. And this is exactly what Chris Dunn tested. Quote, "When the full width of the block was reached, the cutter was passed along the entire surface, and then the step was measured to be 0.003 inches at its deepest part using an interrapid indicator. Across a block the size of the stone at Abu Rawash, the step would have measured 0.183 inches deep. Without an exact measurement of the step in the Abu Rawash block, I would estimate that it is no more than 0.25 inches. Figure 10.3 provides a close-up of the area showing the parallel striations. It seems bordering on the impossible to imagine such an operation being performed by ancient Egyptians, but what other method would create each of the following? 1. A compound radius. 2. Parallel striations that follow an uneven path across the stone. Or 3. A step about 4 inches away from the break." End quote. So again, I think it is, he's admitting, and I'm in the same boat, right? This seems incredible. Like, can you imagine a 37-foot saw being used on a block of granite at some point in ancient times? As implausible as that might sound to you, what other explanation do you have that can explain these features? This is a case of following the evidence to where it leads. And as I said, the implications are pretty wild. So I really want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of Chris Dunn here. I think he's one of the main people, I think one of the only people really since Petrie to have significantly advanced the cause for ancient machining in Egypt using a very engineering-oriented and evidence-based approach. He's following the evidence to where it leads. I did speak to him just the other day for an hour or so discussing this block at Abu Rawash. His opinions on it haven't really changed. These are the measurements. As much as he mentions that it does seem to be bordering on the impossible to imagine this sort of an operation happening, with saws of this size being used many thousands of years ago, this is following the evidence to where it leads. His hypothesis is the only one that I know of that accounts for all of the features that we see in the stone. We do use machines and rotating cutters of various types in our own civilization of and around these sorts of sizes. Tunnel boring machines have rotating cutter faces that are even larger than the calculated diameter of this ancient saw. Those things can get up to in the range of 17 to 18 meters, nearly 60 feet in diameter. Actual circular saw examples include ones that are, funnily enough, used in quarries to cut stone with diameters in the range of several meters. Also, there's some supporting evidence on these sites that suggests it is, or it might be possible, that saws of this size may well once have been in action here. At Giza, at Saqqara, at Abu Rawash, and at other sites, you can find long, deep trenches that are cut into the ground that are known today as boat pits. In 2 out of the 7 of the so-called boat pits found around Khufu's complex, the Great Pyramid, excavations did actually find disassembled wooden boats, again in just 2 of them. The most famous of these was reassembled and put on display for a long time at the Boat Museum that was housed on the south side of the Great Pyramid. They have found wooden boats buried in other spots in Egypt, not buried in boat pits, rather entombed in mud brick enclosures, for example, and certainly not all of the so-called boat pits contained disassembled boats. There was only really a small fraction of them. These sites, places like the Giza Plateau or Abydos, were used as necropolises, as the Egyptian dead, particularly the royalty, their nobles and their aristocracy, were buried there for millennia with items that they might need in the afterlife. Presumably, these dead Egyptians were also experts in boat building and assembly, because the boats never actually fit inside the so-called boat pits. They had to be put in there in some 1,500 or more odd pieces. Seems possible to me that the ancient Egyptians found these pits as a pretty convenient spot to bury a boat for your afterlife. Some of these boat pits, and I've been down into a few of them now, actually have carved steps. It's very different to the typical burial shafts where you were really only ever meant to use them once. Having steps on them suggests that frequent access was required, which just doesn't make sense for a one-time use boat pit. You just chuck the boat parts in, you seal it up, and then job is done. On the other hand, however, if you consider that these pits might have had a function before they were inherited and reused as convenient holes for boats, what might that function have been? Well, it turns out they would work really well for saw pits, for big, giant circular saws of the dimensions that we're talking about in this video. They're long and deep enough for saws of the type that have been hypothesized here by Chris Dunn. Carved steps down into these pits would allow access for things like waste removal, as well as other maintenance, which presumably were all required and very necessary functions, if indeed this sort of thing was once going on here. Chris Dunn even visualized what this might have looked like, and it looks remarkably similar to some of our modern stone cutting operations. I've also had some visualizations done of what these saws may have looked like. I don't know how they were powered, but here's an example of potentially one that could have been powered by something like a water wheel, or you could replace this water wheel with some sort of motor, but presumably these saws must have been attached to something like a shaft that was providing their power for rotation. Returning back one more time to the mysterious concave block of granite at Abu Rawash, I had the chance to examine it in person with another true expert when it comes to precision machining. Chris King, a name that will be familiar to any of you who spend a whole lot of cheddar on high-end bicycle parts, is the founder and owner of Chris King Precision Components, one of the leading manufacturers of custom super high-quality bearings, bottom brackets, headsets, wheels and hubs, things like that, for competition road and mountain bikes. He has been doing precision machining and engineering at an expert level for his entire adult life. And when it comes to witness marks, machining, and manufacturing processes in hard and difficult materials, I'm going to put a lot more weight on his opinion than any Egyptologist, experimental or not. I'm grateful for his attendance and his expert opinion. Here he is inspecting this granite block at Abu Rawash for the first time.
But the pattern that's in just this little piece of quartz right here, there's a kind of a scalloping or a fluting kind of pattern in it. There's nothing on the high points that indicate a back and forth scratching. It's something came across here and left these lines perfectly intact. So which kind of indicates that I think the cutter is probably abrasive, or like a sanding drum kind of thing, but possibly diamond. Who knows? I mean, who knows what they had? But this is definitely the witness of a spinning cutter moving across this. It's easier to see on the quartz than it is on the feldspar, but it's obvious. And then this radius kind of, it's just, I mean, this is the smoking gun, absolutely. It's a little harder out here because they kind of got all the laps to look good.
Yeah, there's like cross lines.
Yeah, you can probably see the lines change a little bit, but when you look at this one pass right here, which is like a single pass, everything's all nice and straight.
It is really smooth there as well, huh?
And you're thinking of more of a rotating drum than a big saw?
This is not a saw.
Okay. Yeah.
This is not a saw that's spun this way. This is something that went this way.
But something cut it with this radius on this end.
Well, they came across here like this, so the cutter has a little bit of a sweep out this way. So they got a little deeper here, and they came across here. They didn't get this to blend with that.
But what about
over
this?
here?
But you have an arc. This line has a pretty regular curve as well.
It does.
It actually is cut this way as well.
Yeah.
If it was a
Is
drum,
that a consistent radius, or is it like a?
Well, they had to turn and keep an arc. It looks like it's been cut
From here
this
to here,
way.
it curves out, right? So it looks like a big radius.
So look down the line here. Look down
Yeah, I see
there.
it, I see it, but I don't know if that's a perfect radius. So, my first impression when I walk up to this and I see that, is that, there's a curve there, but that could easily have just been how they drug the tool across this
Okay. So it could be, like a drum, like a braiding tool that's,
Something that
that's
did this.
rotating this way and it's being...
But I think when you see, the thing that argues against this being a tool that went this way is why isn't that here?
Yeah.
I would think.
Yeah, it's almost inverse.
It would be rotating if it was a
You've got
tool.
the same thing over here, where they didn't get
it
the
would
lap
dig
very
in.
good.
But you think they
But you
would
can
do
feel it all the way across.
that
You
much of
feel
a
the
cut?
little
Where the
humpy
tool
things.
lifted off.
That's what.
You know what I mean? Like there's got to be a start and stop registration too.
Well, that could have been off the part.
Or could it have been two tools?
Thank you.
I just think they took multiple passes.
Chris King here is making really a very similar set of observations that I think are quite complementary to some of the conclusions in the work that's done by people like Chris Dunn on this particular piece. Firstly, he's stating pretty clearly that this is obviously not the result of some sort of back and forth grinding process, that something that was very abrasive ran across the surface of this block and left these clearly defined striations in place. Also, remember, this is Chris King's first time that he's looking at this block. He's not coming at this from the perspective that I think Chris Dunn did when he was writing his book, which was one of having visited it multiple times, taken measurements, done analysis, taken his photographs, and he's made certain measurements. Chris King is saying, well, he doesn't know if, for example, the radius at the top, he's kind of discounting that by saying, well, I don't know how accurate the radius is. We know from Chris Dunn's measurements, and at least what he reports in his book, that it is around 93% accurate, like it is an actual radius. It's not just some random curve that doesn't match a pattern. It is at least 93% accurate as a radius.
Whatever it is, it's about 10 centimeters long. Looking at these lines, it follows a straight sweep this way.
Yeah.
And if I look at this pass, the lines are following
Slightly
this line.
oriented differently, yeah.
They're aligned with this line right here.
Yeah.
So they move this way.
Hmm.
And then I can feel a little hump right here. And another one about right here. If you run your hand
regular,
across
yeah.
this, you feel humps.
That's what I felt, yeah. So you think it is different passes with another,
It's
with some.
different passes.
Yeah.
And and it's not like this one may not have come all the way across. Like I'm feeling a little hump right here. So they may have. That's why I'm thinking it's more of almost a handheld thing.
Yeah.
They're taking a pass. They're being reasonably straight. They don't have to be. All they need to do is kind of get this flat.
Yeah.
Granite planer.
Yes.
I mean, that right there alone is the smoking gun.
Chris King also makes some really, I think, interesting observations and potential conclusions about what shaped this block. He's making those same observations about the striations not necessarily matching that initial leading edge of the curve. The fact that the striations are, grouped together and they follow more straight lines than curved lines. He's also making observations that there seems to be groups of these striations that follow each other in pretty consistent little batches. He's saying like every, 8 or 10 centimeters or something like that. Call it 3 or 4 inches. Now, this is a really interesting measurement, because we know that at the leading edge of this block, about 4 inches back from the top, is where we see that the kerf, where we see that little drop down from potentially, a different motion of a saw that was making passes on it. One of the things I've always wondered about when it comes to this is the actual width of the saw blade that was being used to cut it. We know that it was a very large blade relative to the blocked surface, but we don't know how thick it was. So, for example, with this little example, it looks like it's a very thin piece of metal. This gives you the idea that the circular blade may have been very thin, but in fact, it may well have been quite a bit thicker than that, given the size of it. We can use this phone case as an example. So, if this was a circular saw, you can imagine if it was this sort of a thickness and it was just applied repeatedly, that's going to give it a much more effective motion in terms of making that that cove cut, the concave surface that we see on the block, rather than 1,000 little tiny cuts you're now cutting just along the width of the blade. That actually matches some of the evidence that we see in terms of the little drop down. So above that drop down, it's like one pass of the saw. That may have been the initial 45-degree pass, and then the saw was repeatedly dropped in, in several little repeated motions that matched the width of the saw blade. Ultimately, I think Chris King's observations of the striations and witness marks on the block do match Chris Dunn's hypothesis for the multi-step machining process. Of course, Chris King might disagree with his own conclusion, which again was only really based on his initial inspection over the last 10 minutes, very much a first pass, and it was without the benefit of measurements and a deeper analysis over time. Even then, however, his idea of an extremely abrasive rotating drum that can carve an inch-deep concavity into granite in a single pass is a long, long way from some primitive rubbing back and forth with rocks and sticks and sand. But the whole point of me including this section was to show that another expert like Chris King is also making a similar set of observations of this amazing block at Abu Rawash. Before we bring this video to a conclusion, I think it's necessary that we explore and discuss the nature of these striations, these witness marks. After all, they're observable in many places. They're all made into hard, igneous stone from ancient Egypt, and the standard model has to deal with them somehow, you'd think. These striations are, at least in my opinion, some of the strongest primary evidences for advanced machining. As Chris Dunn and Flinders Petrie before him said, you just don't get these marks if you're using some sort of grinding compound, be it sand or anything else. This is immediately obvious to anyone with even a basic understanding of machining or engineering topics, that you just aren't going to get these witness marks with a slow grinding process. In many places, on many stones, you can see the striations are long, consistently straight or curved, depending on the cut type, and they're generally parallel with their neighbours, at least across wide sections of the cut faces. These are the same striations that exist on the tubular drill holes and the drill cores that I've discussed extensively on this channel. For sure, there are places where these striations wobble or they might overlap, but this still doesn't change their core characteristic, which is that they can only result from actual cutting or a really intense abrasion and not just grinding. All this wobble or the overlap means is most likely that there was a slight wobble or a movement in the saw or in the piece, or that the blade was withdrawn and then reapplied. Again, there is plenty of evidence for this exact sort of thing. Check out this amazing slate piece that's at Abu Sir. It absolutely seems to have had its edges shaved with a circular saw or the like, where the saw was applied repeatedly but almost gently to its edge. So why is all this talk about striations so important? Because they relate directly to the orthodox explanation for how the ancient Egyptians did this work. Whether it's straight cuts, circular cuts, or tube drills, the answer from the academics has always been that they, the dynastic Egyptians, grinded their way through the granite or basalt or diorite with a copper bar or a copper tube using sand as an abrasive compound, in a manual, primitive fashion with apparently nothing more than endless time and human effort at their disposal. Experimental archaeologist Dennis Stocks has long been referenced as the expert who has proven this to be the case. To his credit, he's definitely done the experiments, and we do have him to thank for defining the metrics of just how long it takes to grind through granite with copper and sand. Make no mistake either, I've never ever claimed that this method doesn't work. It does. You can definitely grind your way through hard igneous rock with a copper drag bar and sand if you have enough time and stamina on your hands. Now, while I appreciate Dennis for his experimental approach, he also likes to insist that his experiments with copper tools and sand produce the exact same striations and markings that we see on so many ancient Egyptian sites. The only problem is he only ever just says this. He never shows it. On the PBS production Mysteries of the Nile, made back in the 1990s, they, being Dennis Stocks and Mark Lehner, confidently claim that the same marks are there, the same striations in these saw cuts.
As you can see here, we achieved this in just a few days.
Both methods work, and both produce the same pattern of etched lines as in the old tombs.
These striations, however, are never clearly shown, either in that production or in any of Dennis Stocks' books. It really is somewhat baffling to me that if you're making the claim that your methods produce the same striations as he does in the highlighted passage in his book here, then you think you could actually show a photograph of it. But that's not what we get. These images are the best ones I could find. I was talking about this on a live stream the other day, and we actually looked at that Mysteries of the Nile production from back in the 90s. Mark Lehner went to that unfinished box in the museum and looked at it as an example of the sort of striations we're talking about. So clearly they were able to film and capture these striations. But just compare that image to the one that they supposedly show you as proof of either the grinding copper bar method or the proof of their so-called striations on this small drill core that they ground out with a copper tube.
And then just see, there it goes.
Wow! You popped right out of there.
Oh,
look at
there.
that.
Yes.
That could be fourth dynasty, Dennis.
That's right. We could pass it off easily as a fourth dynasty core.
As I've previously shared in a couple of videos, when Marcus Allen, who is the editor of the UK Nexus magazine, asked Dennis Stocks, who had just delivered a lecture, if his drill core from his experiments looked anything like the deeply grooved or striated Petrie core number 7, Dennis Stocks simply turned around and walked away.
I asked you to ask him if his core, which I couldn't get a good picture of it, to ask him if his core looked anything like this. I mean, I wasn't being a smartass or anything like that. I was just curious if his core looked like the one that was in the Petrie Museum. So.
Well, I showed him after the talk, after the Q&A, we all milled around as you do after talks, and I approached Dennis and asked it. I showed him the picture, and I said, "Did your core look similar in any way to this core?" Now, he obviously knew what I was showing him.
Mm-hmm.
He turned around and walked away. He wouldn't discuss it, anything. He wouldn't even acknowledge I showed him a picture.
What's more, other people have also done drilling and grinding experiments with copper tubes, bars, and sand. Chris Dunn has ground out a granite core with this technique, and the core he extracted from the hole came out pretty smooth and polished, with only very faint scratches, which is exactly what you would expect from a process like this. A good friend of mine, Chuck Kazina, a geologist, a jeweler and machinist, who's travelled with us, he ground out several granite cores using this method with a copper tube. This footage is of me inspecting such a core. As you can see, it's very smooth and polished. He even tried to deliberately recreate these striations on a core, the ones like we see on an ancient core, by literally putting one of these smooth ground cores in a lathe and machining it, and this was the only way he could get close to even replicating the types of circular spiral grooves that we see on a drill core. A lathe really isn't a grinding tool, funnily enough. It uses a cutting point to engrave that groove, which is exactly the sort of thing that we see on these ancient examples. They're just not the result of grinding. I've documented in several previous videos that Penn University did an experiment in the 1980s looking at granite cores ground with various compounds under a microscope, and they all came out with extremely fine scratches that required a microscope to see. Nothing like the deep, continuous, regular and obvious striations found on ancient stonework in Egypt. A lot of these examples I'm giving are of tubular drills, but it is exactly the same process, the exact same striations that we see on the marks left from straight saws as well as the circular saws. It's just much easier to do these experiments if you're just, cutting out a small tube drill rather than a huge saw cut, but it's the same process. Even Petrie tells you it's the same process. All you have to do is to look at this grinding process and to use your brain. Of course, this sort of thing is not going to produce the same striations that we can observe. And that's just when we're talking about the straight saw cuts. Never mind the fact that many striations indicate the use of a circular saw, which is a fact that's pretty much straight up just ignored by any orthodox attempt to explain them. They all just want to tell you that it's some sort of warping of a straight saw blade, which is nonsense. As I demonstrated earlier, if your entry and exit points of any given cut are higher than the center, it's simply impossible to do that with a straight saw. End of story. There are many other problems with this copper bar grinding method that are refuted by the evidence that we have. For one, you have to initially chip or hack some sort of groove into the stone to even get it started.
So you're going to chip a groove, and then you're going to put the copper and slide it back and forth. But how, and that's going to cut the granite?
You heard Lena there. He said they had to hack a groove into the top of the block to even get that copper saw started. If you try to just drag a copper bar across a granite block, it'll just go all over the place. You'll never get it started. However, if you recall from a little bit earlier, Flinders Petrie found and documented very thin slices of basalt that were sawn on both sides, indicating something like a shaving action that was taking place on these blocks. This definitely does not reconcile with needing to roughly gouge a starting groove in your little slice. How would that even work? Certainly no one has ever demonstrated that this grinding with a copper bar process can produce these sorts of results. Funnily enough, this tiny little shallow cut is about as far as any experiments have ever gone, going down a couple of inches at best. Why hasn't somebody sawn all of the way through like a refrigerator-sized block of granite? I mean, it has to be easy work, after all, doesn't it? The ancient Egyptians did this evidently tens of thousands of times. Personally, I think that the physics of a tapering drag bar that's trying to grind a meter or more long cut that deeply into a granite block would become extremely challenging, to the point that friction would just increase until it got stuck. This really seems like an experiment worth doing if you're determined to prove that your copper drag bar could make these marks or could do this sort of work. Yet, as far as I can tell, all that's ever been done is forcing, a couple of poor Egyptian workers to grind back and forth with a copper bar that, goes down maybe a couple of inches, and then they just call it a week. The story doesn't even end here. These striations are typically so regular that you can measure them. Petrie did, as did Chris Dunn and several other people since Petrie's time. How deep they are, which is about 0.5 millimeter, and how far apart they are, typically between 1 and 2 millimeters. Robert Moores Jr. wrote a paper for the 28th edition of the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt in 1991, titled Evidence for Use of a Stone-Cutting Drag Saw by the 4th Dynasty Egyptians. I have covered this previously in this video, linked below, so I'll just summarize here, but it definitely bears repeating because Moore's paper is still sometimes referenced by academics as an explanation for these striations and the cutting of granite in ancient Egypt, and it's, quite frankly, utterly ridiculous. Moores Jr. in his paper documents the striations, he measures them, he proposes the use of a very large, I believe roughly 400 pounds, a little under 200 kilograms, copper drag saw that is several meters long. It's suspended by 2 tripods over a pit filled with water and operated by teams of men on either end swinging it back and forth into a granite block in a reciprocating motion, with other workers in the center presumably adding sand as a grinding compound. The real problem with Moores Jr.'s approach here is that he worked backwards from the measurements of the striations to come up with his solution and his cutting rate. He suggests a single action or pass of this saw would cut into the granite and make a single striation. He worked out the timing of the reciprocal motion of the saw at around 2.84 seconds and hence concluded that the cutting rate it could achieve was around 2 millimeters every 2.84 seconds. That works out to be around 42 millimeters per minute, 1.65 inches per minute. The astute and the mechanically educated amongst you right now might just be laughing out loud. Dennis Stocks, who actually did granite grinding experiments, came up with a cutting or a grinding rate of some roughly 2 millimeters per hour. A long, long way from Robert Morse Jr.'s figures of 2 millimeters per every 2.84 seconds. As noted by Chris Dunn, United States patent number 7082939 for an improved frame saw using carbon alloy steel blades with replaceable segments impregnated with diamonds, cites a cutting downfeed rate of 30 millimeters per hour into granite. That is, admittedly, a lot better than the 2 millimeters per hour of a human-powered copper drag saw that was figured out by Dennis Stocks, but sadly it still lags Robert Morse Jr.'s solution at an almighty 84 times less cutting rate than his godly figure of 42 millimeters per minute. I've been looking at these cuts and these striations with considerable interest for many years now. I think Chris Dunn is correct when he suggests these cuts were made on site, and that seems to be backed up by Flinders Petrie's evidence of finding slices of stone, evidently small corrections that are being made on site to fit blocks together. We know that these stone blocks came from the quarry with so-called padding up to a foot or more of excess material, presumably to protect them during transport. We know this from many of the unfinished projects, things like the granite blocks of the third pyramid or the unfinished boxes of the Serapeum. The striations and these cut faces were, typically, not the intended finished state of the stone. Almost all of the cuts at the basalt pavement at Giza are visible on the sides of the blocks. These are not ever intended to be visible, and they're only there and we can see them now because it's been partly destroyed and we can actually see their sides. The top of these basalt blocks, the part that you're intended to walk on and look at, has been ground and polished to be very smooth. It's also remarkably level. We see the same sort of thing on objects like the boxes that we find in the Serapeum or under the pyramid at Lahoun. If these were granite blocks that were sawn initially, as it seems likely, then those marks were then eventually polished out. It's not just polished surfaces either that they were chasing as the intended final result. We can also observe in many places, particularly on the sides of stones that were meant to be adjacent to each other, that the cut surface was deliberately roughened up by hammering. This is particularly obvious on the basalt pavement at Giza, where the machined surface has literally been hammered off that results in a rough texture. We know this happened in this order because the hammered surface is lower. I can only imagine they did this in order to increase the surface tension between two adjoining faces of the blocks. Imagine if you had two of these basalt blocks that were housed next to each other, if their mating surfaces were fairly smooth, as would have been the case with the fine striations or just after these saw cuts, they might have moved a little bit when they were under some sort of pressure or force. But if those mating surfaces were hammered roughly, then they'd still be flat, they'd still have their dimensions, but there would be much more surface tension, much more resistance to movement, and it would make these blocks tightly interlocked.
No tool in the ancient Egyptian toolbox for this. Like that's the thing.
You can see the hammering is later.
Exactly, to lock the pieces together. Exactly. So
like same as the Abu Ghraib.
Same as on
Giza.
eastern side of Great Pyramid. When they found these to lock them together.
Yeah. And there's a lip here too. Yeah. Same thing.
Yeah.
You get the undercut, so you can actually see the width of the blade.
Yeah, here it is too.
We can see exactly the same thing on the alabaster bowls, these crazy looking things at Abu Ghraib. These strange cog-shaped circular artifacts have been shaped as the top part of much more cubic blocks of alabaster, and to me this is a clear indication that they were set in place in a floor or as part of a pavement or structure. On the machined edges of these blocks, the same thing is going on here. The sawn, faceted faces have been deliberately roughened up after they were machined. Again, we know this because the machined surface is at a higher level than the hammered surface. And again, I think this was done so that the blocks could be very tightly interlocked with their neighbor in whatever original configuration they were in. This does scream some sort of function to me, but, you know, that's a road to speculate down another day. This video is already getting crazy long. So, obviously, at the end of the day, all of this is still just speculation. I did, as I said, spoke with Chris Dunn about this quite a bit, as he told me trying to work backwards and figure out what happened here when there's been some sort of movement in the cutter or movement in the piece, as there clearly was here, or, you know, when, as he put it, the shit hits the fan and errors are made. It's incredibly difficult to puzzle out exactly what happened from the witness marks alone. Here are what I think are the major variables worth considering. Those I think that are the major unknown factors in this that have a bearing on the evidence that we have. Firstly, the width of the blade that's been used here. From Chris King's observations, the evidence does seem to support a pretty wide working face of the tool, some 8 to 10 centimeters, call it 4 inches or so. Interestingly, this is about the distance from the leading edge of the radial cut to the step down. Although we've been discussing the possibility of a very large-scale machining process occurring here, there are a couple of aspects of this type of thing that could very well have an impact on the witness marks that we're seeing. Things like cooling, material removal, and maintenance requirements for something that operates on this scale. All you have to do is look at how we do this sort of machining and cutting into incredibly tough material like granite today. A huge amount of heat gets generated. It requires a dedicated flow of coolant or water, which presumably helps to deal with the material removal, taking away the stuff that has been cut. As you might imagine, the heat that gets generated in a process like this, as well as the nature of the very tough material being cut, would also wear down the saw face. And with a saw of this size, it's pretty unlikely that you would just throw it all away once it got worn out. I think it's much more likely that a saw of this size would operate like the ones that we have today, in that you would have removable and replaceable segments that do the actual abrasive work. When you change out a worn segment of a cutting face or a section of this blade for a new one, it's going to impact the witness marks that are left. Lastly here, the other consideration I have is thinking about what this machining work might actually have been for. Unfortunately, we really don't have enough pieces of the puzzle to provide an answer here. I do tend to lean towards it's something functional. I don't think this piece was simply a waste or an offcut. I think it was being shaped for a specific reason. It might be that this is only a fragment of the original artifact. We'll never really know. What's also clear to me is that this isn't specifically precision work. We do know from many other pieces with overcuts or overruns of what seem to be powerful tools like these that mistakes in machining were definitely made by the builders. But perhaps it just wasn't that important to make it super accurate. For example, as Petrie first observed, there are overruns made into the granite box in the King's Chamber. On that same box, there are also a couple of spots where tubular drills were run a little too far into the sides. We also know that the saw cutting the unfinished box in the Cairo Museum ran its way off course. I've also demonstrated in the past the presence of overcuts from both circular saws and tube drills on many of the amazing and high quality statues that are made from granite or diorite. So I think we can say that the purpose of this sort of machining really wasn't specifically for precision, or at least not high precision. But we certainly do know that they, the builder culture, were capable of delivering high precision. And usually on the objects that display precision, we don't tend to see things like witness marks and striations, at least on those surfaces. I'm talking about things like the Serapeum boxes, which are all remarkably well polished. Another example would be the box under the Lahoun Pyramid, which was featured in this video on my channel. It was documented by Flinders Petrie as being flat and square within single-digit thousandths of an inch across its long axis. He described it as being, quote, ground to an impalpable fineness, end quote, and it also doesn't show machining marks. Then, of course, there is the measured precision of the incredibly hard stone vases. Typically, we measure the precision of those things on the polished surfaces, although they do actually display machining marks sometimes on the insides. So, how do all these steps fit together? And look, this is more speculation, but I think what we're looking at on this block and on the other examples of sawn and cut material with striations is an intermediate step in the range of machining operations that were undertaken by this builder culture. On one end, we have the rough and extreme level of material removal that seems to have been happening at the quarries. It's evidenced by these scoop marks, which seem to be meant to remove as much material as quickly as possible. And we know that the extracted blocks have lots of padding or excess material on them when they're shipped to the sites. Sometimes as much as a foot of granite still needs to be removed to get down to the required size when the blocks reach the site. That operation of cutting off this padding and basically cutting these blocks down to size is where the on-site sawing seems to have taken place. Perhaps it was the result of saws that were housed in these giant pits. Blocks were taken to them, they were sawn down and shaped to roughly their required size. Perhaps they were shaved down again as necessary. Maybe this was an operation that was conducted by the straight saws. But we know this happened. It's evidenced by Flinders Petrie, who found and documented these sliced pieces of basalt that were thin and sawn through on both sides. From there, if this block was a part of a larger construction with its neighbours, it might have had its sides or its bottoms deliberately roughened up in order to increase surface tension and help to lock the structure together. It might have also gone on to further precision machining steps designed to deliver the finished surfaces and finished precision as required. There is evidence for this precise but not yet polished machining steps on objects like the boxes in the Serapeum.
And as a stone carver, I said like this cannot be the normal style of polishing that they think it was done. Here also we have other machining, probably the latest layer. We saw how the rough machining reached a certain point. We have more machining here. Look at it here. Fine lines. If you can bring it with your camera. You see there are fine lines.
Yeah.
You see it?
Yes.
That looks like the final process or the final stage of smoothing before they give it the shiny polish.
After that final machining step, there seems to be another phase, which is the polishing that gets us to that mirror finish, the sort of thing that we see on most of the surfaces of the boxes in the Serapeum or the original surface of blocks like these ones in the Valley Temple.
That's a great angle on that. Hang on.
Look at the precise way.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Yeah, this little corner here, it's just kind of mind-blowing, isn't it?
Now, this is why these videos get so long and why it's taken me several videos like this to build up to making statements like those I've just made. I think if you started claiming there were giant 10+ meter circular saws operating at some point in ancient Egypt and they were only one step in a multi-step machining process that results in the blocks that we see, and if you did that without first sort of establishing enough baseline context and supporting evidence, you'll just get called a lunatic. Heck, even with all of the evidence and the context, I still get called a lunatic. As there is definitely a group of people who, no matter what the evidence says or where it leads, will refuse to even consider the possibility of advanced technology being used in the past. However, as I said, this is where the evidence leads. These statements and these conclusions, as speculative and as incredible as they might be, they are the result of following the evidence to where it leads, as many others have done before me. In our civilization, the start of the Industrial Revolution, the beginnings of the modern age of technological development, and the birth of the discipline of engineering has granted us fresh context and new ways to evaluate the evidence around us. Flinders Petrie in the 1800s was the first to apply the newly developed engineering and scientific methods from the Industrial Revolution to these enigmas. He knew that the witness marks and signatures wrought into the ancient stone of Egypt meant that something far more compelling than simple stone hammers or grinding tools was at work here, and he said as much. Quote, "We now know, however, that jeweled saws and drills were the tools used by pyramid builders, and the rough stone hammers are of exactly the types belonging to the rude remains of Ptolemaic times. These, therefore, more probably tell of destruction rather than of construction." End quote. Nearly 150 years after Petrie wrote those words, and with all the technological development and progress those years have brought, the expert engineers and machinists of our time still share his opinion. The only legitimate explanation for the evidence at hand is far more sophisticated and capable tools than those found in the toolboxes of the dynastic ancient Egyptians. The proof is there for those with the eyes to see it. If nothing else, I hope videos like this one help to open more minds to the amazing potential and the possibility of advanced human civilizations that existed long in the past, the lessons we might learn from them, and to get just a little bit closer to the truth. Thanks for watching. Well, a big thank you if you made it this far into the video. I know this one was pretty long. It really did take a little piece of my soul with it, but it's a topic that I've been wanting to get into and revisit for quite some time, so I hope you enjoyed it. Quick reminder, if you are interested in seeing any of these sites in person, I do take people to Egypt every year. We are going back there again in December of 2026. You can check out all of the details for that trip on my website. It's unchartedx.com/primordial2026, or just click on the link in the description or the pinned comment below. Also, and as always, I want to extend a massive thank you to everybody who does choose to support Uncharted X through that value for value model. You guys really are the reason that I'm able to keep researching and writing and producing and making content like this. I really don't fit into the mold of the typical, YouTube model, which is to upload fairly frequently. I know I can go, sometimes more than a month in between uploads. It's because it takes such a long time to write and then record and produce these sorts of videos. So thank you guys so much for your support. I do try to give back a little bit as much as I can in terms of producing supporter-only content, early access to videos. I also do give out producer credits. These are real credits. You can use them on IMDb. You can put them on your LinkedIn. I will always vouch for them. All of the details for how to get those, as well as to understand all the other models and ways to support Uncharted X through that value for value model, is again all on my website. It's unchartedx.com/support. And lastly here, just if you are interested in seeing more content from me, I do have a second channel on YouTube for shorter, less produced content. Some of the highlights and the jams from the tours, for example, make it on there. It's called Uncharted X Live. You can find it right here on YouTube. There is a link to it in the description below. It also does feature short compilations from some of my live streams, which I also tend to do, particularly while I'm in the process of making these videos. If you're interested in those live streams, you can find them over on Twitch. It's twitch.tv/UnchartedX. And you can get notifications for when I'm going live in my Discord. If you're interested in joining that, there is also a link for that below in the description. I've certainly gone on long enough here. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll catch you in the next one. Bye bye now.